We are in Revelation, the 13th chapter. Before we get started into the 13th chapter, are there any questions or comments before we continue forward? You'll recall that in the 12th chapter, we started with the great sign in heaven and the glorious woman giving birth to the male child who was to rule the earth with the iron rod, and that there was a dragon waiting to devour him upon his birth. However, the male child was taken up or caught up to God and to his throne, verse 5, and the woman was taken to a place in the wilderness that was prepared to be nurtured and cared for 1,260 days, or 3.5 years. Then we see the war in heaven, verses 7 through the end of the chapter, 7 through 17. And in summary, we see that God has taken the kingdom of God from the physical realm into the spiritual realm. And one of the consequences of that is that Satan can no longer directly do battle with God's people. He cannot gather a nation and physically attack them in the same way that he could the physical kingdom of Jerusalem. And so in verse 12 we see that stated, "Therefore rejoice, O heavens." Who do we say the heavens refer to? Who's living in heaven? The heavens. God? Okay? That's absolutely true. Those who are saved. So the church, the spiritual realm, not being the literal heaven, but rejoice, O heavens, or those in the church, and you that dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth, being land of Israel, and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because it knows that its time is short. And what we looked at the end of that chapter, as we've looked at leading on to that, is the chaos that's breaking loose, both in Rome and in Jerusalem, that follows these events. Now, I wanted to summarize that 12th chapter because the idea of the earth and the sea representing both Rome and Israel is relevant to the next two chapters. In the King James translation, at the end of verse 12, I'm sorry, I'm saying that backwards. At the end, verse 12 ends with, "and have the testimony of Jesus Christ." Some of your translations, all the more recent English translations that are translated from other manuscripts, do not end there. In fact, the statement is put at the end of verse 17, "and he stood on the sand of the sea." In the King James, you'll see a similar statement at the first verse of verse 13. "And I stood upon the sand of the sea." The reason for the difference in translations here, it has solely to do with manuscripts. That's different in the different manuscripts that these two translations were translated from. But that's important for us because I think that King James is obviously more correct in the context here. That is John standing on the sea, the sand of the sea. Because as he's standing on the sand of the sea, he sees a beast come out of the sea, and he sees a beast come up from the earth. And that makes a lot more sense than having at the end of chapter 12, "and he stood on the sand of the sea." He would refer to, most likely, the great dragon, which represents Satan. Any questions or comments on
I just have a question on back in chapter 12, where in verse 12, notice he has but a short time. Speaking of Satan, why is that?
Why does he have a short time?
Yeah.
That is something that I looked into that I don't have a strong answer for. Because I think it's easy if we say that he has a limited time. But that word short is more restrictive than limited time.
Even so, why is that?
Because the end, I think that one of the ideas in it is the final judgment where he's going to be cast into the lake of fire is coming. So his time is restrained.
I agree.
My idea of my concern or my difficulty with that is short. If it's referring to 70 AD, where he's trying to cause this devastation and everything blows up in his face, then that makes sense that we're short. But
That's a long
I
time.
struggle. Yes, I agree. And so that is a difficulty for me, Mike.
Yeah,
Yep.
me too.
And apparently, you can normally tell when commentators have a difficulty with things too, because you just can't read about it. It's just absent in there. In that the idea of short, I found no support for it.
Yes. You think about it, it's tough.
Yeah.
You can't poo-poo it off either, because it's there.
No, and it's it's a significant part of what he's saying there.
Yes, it is.
Anything else? Anyone have a question I can answer? All right then. Chapter 13, and we will read 1 through 4. Well, let me rephrase that. We will read 1 through 10, and then we'll break it up and look at it in more detail. Would someone read those verses 1 through 10 for me?
And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his head the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat, the great authority. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth, speaking great things and blaspheming, and the power was given unto him to continue 42 months. As he opened his mouth in blaspheming against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and to overpower them. And the power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life, slain from the foundation of the world. If any man have an ear, let him hear. He that liveth or leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. There is patience, or here is patience and the faith of the saints.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So we have the first beast here. I noted last week that it's important to keep these beasts separate from the dragon. In chapter 12, we have the dragon. And the dragon was ready to devour the male child. When he could not do that, he declared war on the saints. And he sends a flood out of his mouth to devour them, to destroy them. But what saved them from that great flood? Verse 16.
The earth opened up and swallowed the flood.
But the earth opened up and swallowed the flood. So I suggested that what we have there is the Roman Empire being used by Satan to attack the Christian nation. We have this siege taking place, started under Nero. And they're being persecuted. They're being put to death in awful ways. And so Satan is attacking the church. But what distracts Rome from her pursuit of the Christians? What's the earth referred to throughout so much of the Old Testament? Land?
Israel.
Israel, right? Israel so provokes Rome. Remember that the flood, seas, waters represent Gentiles, heathen nations. Here, the Roman nation. This water is going to overtake the Lord's people, but the earth opens up and helps her by swallowing the flood. Now, Israel did not do that intentionally. She unintentionally provokes Rome so much that Rome turns its fury on Israel and then devours her. So, we have the dragon who's in control of this, who is orchestrating. When I use that word control, it's not a good word, because who ultimately is in control?
God.
God. That's the premise of the entire book, right? But Satan is orchestrating this, and so he's attacking. And so we have the dragon. Now, what we're going to see are two servants of the dragon. They are represented as beasts. And the first half of chapter 13, the first beast, where does she come from? Out of the sea. What does the sea represent? What kind of nations? She's prodding you, Christian. No? She's prodding you. Do you think she has the answer? Prod her back. See what happens. What?
He just told me the answer.
He told you the answer. Is he
said Gentiles.
Is he bashful? His faith is here. The Gentile nations, or the Rome here, right, is the sea. This beast is coming out of the sea. It's a heathen nation. It is the nation of Rome, I believe. Let's look at 1 through 4. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems or crowns on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. We'll take one verse at a time. If you turn over to chapter 17, and we look at verses 9 through 11, there's a big help here on what these heads mean. Verse 9 through 11 of chapter 17 reads, "This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, and the other has not yet come. And when he does come, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction." So what are the 7 horns?
7 mountains.
7 mountains. I don't believe it's coincidental to this very day Rome is known as a city of 7 mountains. In fact, I shared last week that on 5 of these 7 hills to this day there are temples, there are monuments naming these mountains and giving credit to them. So there are 7 mountains. The 10 horns or crowns with their horns with crowns, what are they?
10 kings.
They are 10 kings. I believe here in, that these are the 10 Caesars. And when we get into 17, we'll talk about specifically who they were. But this time, and we'll see this by the end of this chapter, I believe, we have Nero as being the Caesar on the throne at this particular time. So we have a big hint there to what he is talking about with this beast. And blasphemous names on its heads. What did we, when we looked at the background of all this that's taking place, what were these emperors calling themselves? Starts with Julius Caesar, the first Caesar himself. What did they believe they were?
Lords.
Lords? Can you be more specific? You're correct. Gods, right? Augustus means, that wasn't his, Octavia was his mother given name. Augustus means the only reverend one, right? It's the Almighty, we might say. They claimed to be deity, and went on. Augustus was the first to claim deity, but while he was still alive. Most of them they claimed that were gods after they were deceased, but that changed with Augustus. By the time we're into 60 AD and even prior to that, the emperor cult is prevalent. There are temples. In fact, Herod the Great, this will be relevant in what we look at for the second half of this chapter, but Herod the Great built right in Caesarea, so in the Jewish realm, a temple to Tiberius, right? Where Tiberius was worshipped as a god. Now, of what nationality was Herod the Great? He was a Jew, right? He was king over the Jewish people. And he'll come into play as we look at this second beast. So they have blasphemous names on their heads. They are claiming to be gods. Verse 2, and the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. How many of you read Daniel 7 and Daniel 9 before tonight? Shirley says, forgot.
I wrote it down.
You wrote it down. That was a start, Shirley. So we won't hold Faith accountable for having not read it this week. But in Daniel 7 and Daniel 9, we see Daniel interpreting dreams. And these beasts are rising. In fact, there is a lion, there is a bear, and there is a leopard in Daniel 7 and 9. Each of those represent, does anyone remember? You have to remember quite a while since you didn't read it this past week. A great empire, right? The Babylonian, the Assyrian, the Persian Empire. And I did not say those in proper order neither, but what follows them? The Roman Empire. And Daniel prophesies in the midst of this empire, a kingdom, Daniel 2:44, a kingdom will come about that will break them all into pieces and devour them all. Right? Now, what we see with this beast is that they are all combined into one beast. This beast had, I saw, was like a leopard. By the way, John gives these beasts in the exact opposite order that Daniel gives them in. I see that I saw it was like a leopard, and its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. I believe that we see all of Daniel's beasts combined in one because Rome was culmination, was the pinnacle, was the end of these great empires being represented that Daniel prophesied about. And to the dragon, unto it, the dragon gave his power and his throne and his great authority. There's that significance between the difference between Satan and his vehicle, right? The vehicle is Rome, the dragon is Satan himself. And so he's backing the Roman Empire to do its bidding. What example can you think of that represents that idea that I just suggested better than any other? What is the single most glaring example of Satan using the Roman Empire to do his bidding?
Nailing Christ to the cross.
Absolutely. Nailing Christ to the cross. And by the way, at the second beast, I think we'll see the other part of that equation with the Jewish nation. So the power is really coming from Satan, but the Roman Empire is the vehicle that's getting it done. And by the way, stop me if you have a question or comment. Oh, I said that just in time. Go ahead.
Can we, in a lot in Matthew 24 and the day of the Lord, we often think of the Roman Empire as God's vehicle showing judgment on Israel. You're suggesting that it's both Satan's and God's vehicle?
Yes, in the same way, Genesis 3 and 15 predicted that Satan was to bruise Christ's heel. But Satan is attacking Christ there, but he's actually just fulfilling God's plan with crucifying Christ. So all along, Satan is thinks he's manipulating history in these nations to do his bidding, but it's all in ultimate control of God. And I think that's what we see the change when we get halfway through chapter 11. The first half of this book, we saw all these events coming from a heavenly view, right? And so you see the the Lamb opening a seal and then God enacting these things. You see an angel blowing a trumpet, each of the 7 trumpets, and God enacting these things. Now we're seeing the same events from a more earthly viewpoint. We're no longer just have John standing in heaven viewing them. We're seeing it from the earthly standpoint. So we see both events represented as God enacting them and is the great dragon manipulating them. Does that answer your question? Verse 3. One of the heads seemed to have had a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. I think there's 2 very plausible explanations for this. Notice that it doesn't say which head is wounded. It's possible, and some suggest that what this is referring to, the wounded head, was Julius. Julius Caesar, of course, is the first individual that takes Rome from a republic to an empire. But how did the Senate feel about that?
I like it.
They didn't like it. And eventually there was so much, even though Julius was warned about this, what was he warned about?
The Ides of March.
The Ides of March. Notice I came back over here. I knew where I could get the answer of nowhere else. Right? And eventually,
Et tu, Brute.
Et Brute. It's you, Brutus. He's stabbed by his friend. Right? Because he's ruined the republic. He's declared himself as emperor. Now, for a short while, it goes back to a republic. But then, and my line of Caesars are failing me. Is it Octavia who follows Caesar? But at any rate, after he's in power for a while, he immediately goes back to an empire, and Rome never returns back to a republic again. That's possible of what the wounded head refers to. I personally believe that this is more likely. When Nero dies, Nero commits suicide, 68, I believe. We have, bear in mind, we read in 17 about the 10 kings. The 5 were, 1 is, and 1 that's about to come won't remain for very long. When Nero dies, the empire Rome goes into such chaos that almost all historians record that it was not going to survive. And we have the year of 4 Caesars, 4 emperors, all in 1 year's time. And a couple of the Caesars, a couple of the emperors, I should say, actually are Rome's worst enemies. They are ransacking Rome itself. And it's not till Vespasian leaves his conquest in Judea, comes back and takes control and saves Rome. At which point people thought it wasn't possible that it would even survive. Personally, that's what I believe the wounded head is. That all of the world looked and said the empire's dead. And it's seen as miraculous that it survives. And by the way, Chris isn't with us tonight, but Vespasian was known as the mule trader. Right? So of all people to save an empire, such as Rome, it's a mule trader that saves the empire. How unlikely. Questions or comments on the mortally wounded head that heals?
You know what I thought that meant to me when Jesus gave the devil a mortal wound to the head.
Okay?
That's what I thought that was.
Yeah, and I can see the similarities there. Although Satan never's really going to recover from that one, right? Yeah, but certainly a lot of similarities. So at the end of 3, that the whole earth marveled and followed the beast. They worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against him?" Herod himself is quoted leading up to the rebellion of the Jewish people against Rome is saying almost, Josephus records his words, as saying almost exactly what's recorded here. He basically says, this is Rome. You've lost so many wars, he goes on to tell the Jewish people. You've lost so many wars even amongst yourselves. And this is Rome. Who could ever stand against her? Herod is giving these words. I find it interesting, interestingly coincidental, if not more, that we have those almost that exact quote from them. Verse 5. And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words. It was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. Now we have this 3.5 years over and over again. The primary meaning is less than 7, not complete, right? Half of 7. But I think there are a couple of time frames here that are interesting to point out. Nero's persecution of the church is almost exactly 3.5 years long. And by the way, this is a little cloudy because they overlap. the Vespasian and Titus's campaign against Israel, ending with the destruction of Jerusalem, is, can you guess how long? 3.5 years. Real close to that time frame. So I again, those are some interesting sidelines, if you will. Verse 6, it opened its mouth and uttered blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. I see the persecution of the church loud and clear there. He's blaspheming God, his dwelling place, and those who dwell in heaven. Again, if we take that heaven in this part of the book to mean that God's people, he's attacking and making light of God's people.
Is that Hades or is that heaven?
Heaven here in these couple verses, I believe, represents God, the church, on earth. And I believe that's what in chapter 12, when we see that Satan is thrown out of heaven and is going to the earth and to the sea, that the church has been moved into a realm that he cannot directly influence, a spiritual realm. I know the background to your question there, but I think it's a different vein. Verse 7, and it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. Mike, here's another passage that when you asked me about the short time, this verse came to my mind too, because there's one word here, and I like the King James word of overpower. Here's as Bob read it, but I don't like it more necessarily because it's more accurate. There's a problem with understanding it, I believe, here. So it was allowed to make war on who?
Saints,
The saints. So who are we talking about specifically?
church.
The church, right? We're not making war on Israel here. We're making war on the saints. And to conquer them. At no time do we see Rome or anyone else ever conquering the church, do we? Now, my understanding of this, and I'm hesitant in this because so many of the scholars I've read concerning it seem to struggle with it more than the simplicity that I'm going to present. What I do see is from a physical standpoint, Rome does conquer them. Rome does overpower them. They are helpless against Rome, right? They're being put to death in all kinds of horrific ways. And they're not even fighting back. So in a physical sense, I believe this, can very easily be stated. But conquer, and the Greek word used here is to conquer. And certainly in a spiritual sense, we do not see it happening. Questions or comments?
Yeah, I'd like to
Go ahead.
back up to verse 4. They worship the dragon, that's Satan. So they actually worship Satan. What they're saying here.
Yes. And now, is that
They as in
satanic
the Romans?
worship?
Are we talking the Romans worshiping Satan?
Yes. And I think in the next second half of this chapter, we'll see that Israel is doing the same thing. They're worshiping the beast, which is Rome. Now, the word worship there is to pay homage. So I think the idea here is they are doing his bidding. They are controlled completely. They've submitted to Satan, and therefore they are worshiping him. As I said, in the second half of this chapter, we're going to see that Israel, or the beast of the land, worships the beast of the sea. In that way, think about what, isn't it John 19, where they respond to Pilate and say, we have no king but Caesar. Right? They are paying homage to Rome. To the point, think about what Antichrist, and by the way, Revelation does not use that word. Think about what Antichrist means. They followed false Christ, rejected the true Christ in lieu for power such as Rome. David?
They probably didn't know they were following Satan.
Yes, I think that's the case. Does that answer question? I think it's easy for us to think as satanic rituals when we read that, but I think it's more of submission and reverence of life. So all who dwell on earth will worship it, verse 8. And everyone whose name has been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life, and the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. So who worships? Here we're talking about the beast, right? The beast is worshiping Satan. Here we're talking about worshiping the beast. Who's worshiping the beast?
Non-Christians.
Non-Christians. Mike?
Because you're not a Christian unless you're in that book of life.
Exactly. So Mike gets to the exception. Everyone else is worshiping this beast, right? Now, in 9, and I was optimistic we'd cover the whole chapter. We're going to get half the chapter done, so that's an accomplishment. Verse 9, we're going to read two pieces that will be good to end with. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. Now, we heard that to each of the 7 churches in the beginning of Revelation, didn't we? Now I'm going to jump to the end. Here is a call for endurance and faith, perseverance, of the saints. These words here in 10 are a word of encouragement. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword, and with the sword must he be slain. The captive is going to be taken captive. They who slays with the sword is going to be slain. Who's doing it? Who's taking them captive? Who's slaying the Christians? Rome in this context. And so John is saying they will have that fall back on them. Thank you for your time.